Hi everyone, Aaron here for Zollotech, and iOS 13 has been, well, less than what most people had hoped for, but this seems to be the case every other year. And so I wanted to talk about iOS 13 all the way back to iOS 10 and talk about why I think iOS 14 will be a lot better. Now, each one of these phones has what many consider to be the best version of iOS running on them. So if we open up this one, we have an iPhone 4S. This is running iOS 6.1.3, so we'll just log in here. Then we'll go to the iPhone 5C, which has iOS 10 on it. So we'll unlock it. Then we'll go into the iPhone 6, which has iOS 12 on it, and Touch ID is a little screwy there, but now it's working. And then we'll go into my iPhone 11 Pro Max, which has iOS 13 on it. And so what I did is last week I did a poll to see which version of iOS you thought was best and what your thoughts of iOS 13 was, because every other year it seems like Apple updates the OS with much more stability and a lot better overall just usability, where it doesn't seem to have as many issues. So I went back and looked at different versions, and so here we have iOS 6.1.3, like I said, iOS 10, iOS 12, and iOS 13. And it seems like every other year, Apple makes it better. So ever since iOS 6 was out, many people had all sorts of issues with iOS 7, 8, and 9, and then when 10 came out, it seemed to be much more stable. And with iOS 10, Apple made some refinements. They changed some things. You can see here's the control center, and it's a lot different. But if we go home, double click the home button, we've got the card system, and it was a really nice version of iOS that seemed to be super stable. If we go into the music app, it may take a moment to load here, but you can see the library is there. It's a little bit different, and I'm not connected to the internet, but I think you get the idea that this was a version that many people did not have an issue with. Now, what I seem to hear the most is that iOS 12, when it came out 2 years later, fixed all sorts of issues that iOS 11 had and was much more refined. We've got a new control center here. We've got basically the same card system as far as doing multitasking. Things have been updated a little bit. It had refinements, but it also worked a lot more smoothly. So if we go into the settings, go to General, you'll see this one was recently updated to iOS 12.4.7, and I did a video about that. And so this version still gets updates. Now, a lot of people have been saying iOS 13 is terrible. Apple needs to update it. They've updated it way too many times. They haven't gotten it right. So I looked back over the previous versions, and by this time last year, when we had iOS 12 in May, we had already had 10 updates at this point. We were all the way up to iOS 12.3.1. And at the same point the previous year, iOS 11, which I said every other year seems to have an issue, iOS 11 had 14 updates, and iOS 10 had 10 updates. So it seems like iOS 10 and 12 had 10 updates, and iOS 13 has had 13 updates. So we went 10, then 14, then back to 10. Now we're at 13 with iOS 13.5. And so Apple is refining it, and I was surprised how many of you actually say you really like iOS 13, but quite a few of you have still said it's terrible. So I wanted to talk about why I think iOS 14 will be much better. And there's a couple reasons, and then we'll take a look at that poll in a little bit and see what a few of you had to say about which version is your favorite and bugs you've experienced. Now with iOS 14, you can expect it to be much better, and there's a couple reasons for that. One of them is just statistically every other year seems to be much better, but then also we haven't heard of a whole lot of other features with it, and so that makes me think that it's very much focused on stability. Now there was some information about last December or so where it said that Craig Federighi, who's in charge of software, is redoing how they handle internal builds and how they make sure things are stable before they're pushed to the public. So they may be rebuilding the OS a little bit, maybe even modular like Android is. So Android right now can actually insert parts of the operating system. Instead of having to download a 2 gigabyte file or 500 megabytes, they can just push up a 20 megabyte file, fix part of that operating system, and you're done. Whether or not Apple will do this is hard to say, but with iOS 14, we're not hearing a lot of features. Some of the features that we've actually heard about seem like augmented reality focused, things like changes to wallpaper, and there just hasn't been enough information that's come out, and we're only a few weeks away from WWDC where we should see iOS 14, that it makes me think that iOS 14 really doesn't have a whole lot of features, but rather a lot of bug fixes in stability, battery life, and things like that. So with iOS 13, everybody really liked one feature, and that was dark mode. And so when you have dark mode, it's really nice that you have that option, but other than that, people weren't really impressed with the feature set, even though there were a ton of changes to it. I still would expect quite a few changes, but I would not expect things that are dramatic. We have heard that Apple may make it available to have the widgets that we have here, have something resizable on the home screen, but that's sort of a rumor at this point, and I don't know that anyone's actually seen that. So augmented reality, we should have that car key update, a few other things, and whether or not Apple changes anything other than that is hard to say until we actually see what iOS 14 is about. But based off statistics, every other year, every version has gotten much better every other year. So we have what's called a tick-tock cycle, if you haven't heard that before. We have one where there's a lot of features, then there's a lot of stability, and back and forth. So the next update, iOS 14, should have that stability. Now, when I go to this YouTube community poll that I ran, I said, iOS 13, what's your opinion of it and favorite iOS version? And 60% of you actually said that it was great. And that really surprised me because there are quite a few bugs. Apple has pushed a lot of updates, and you'll see 60% said it was great, 32% said it was okay, but it still had bugs, and only 8% of you said it was terrible. Based on the amount of comments I get, which is probably people that have a negative experience, they're going to comment more, I was surprised to learn that only 8% of you say it's terrible. Now you'll see 288 of you commented, and that was really interesting to me that many people really like iOS 13, so I was surprised by that. So you'll see favorite version was probably iOS 10. We'll see my favorite version was iOS 7, which surprises me because iOS 7 was crazy buggy, especially right away. So it was a major change, a complete rewrite of the operating system, and had a lot of issues initially. iOS 12 is a bit good, but haven't tested in iOS 13. You'll see someone said iOS 7 and iOS 13, which surprises me. Again, 7 I don't have fond memories of. And then we have a few that say iOS 10. If we take a look at this one, you'll see iOS 12 is my favorite. And for those of you that have been beta testing these and been using these updates for a very long time, I've been using iPhone since the first one, it was really pretty stable from the first version to iOS 6. iOS 7 was buggy, 8 was better, 9 was buggy, 10 was better. So every other year, like I said. We'll take a look at a couple more, and it says iOS 13, but it's too buggy. So it's your favorite. I'm assuming that's because you like the features in it, like dark mode. But again, iOS 13 or 12 is probably my favorite. iOS 10, without a doubt. iOS 12 with a dark mode option would be better than iOS 13. I'd say iOS 12. It seemed to fix what iOS 11 did wrong and had issues with, and it had some very useful features. My favorite version is iOS 13.4.1. I miss iOS 6 looks. 7 to 13 is pretty much the same. And with the exception of, well, there's a lot of features, hundreds actually, that have been added, but they're usually incremental features. So yes, they do look similar, but so did iOS 3 through 6, or 1 through 6, really, to be fair. iOS 13 is great. iOS 13 is fine, but iOS 12 was much better in terms of stability. iOS 12. And I expected most people that have been using the last version to say iOS 12. It really surprised me that as many people actually liked iOS 13. However, I really think that has to do with the dark mode feature and a few other things. Now, with iOS 14, I would expect the beta on June 22nd if everything stays the same. That's when WWDC is. I've talked about this numerous times. And usually the first beta will be out then, and then the final version will usually be out in September. However, if Apple actually pushes the iPhone launch to October, we may not see the final version until October. So we should have iOS 13 updates probably until this time next year, just like we're still seeing iOS 12 updates for security issues. And I would expect more updates to iOS 13 all the way up until the launch. We'll have regular updates, and then of course some security updates after that for years to come. So keep your eyes open for iOS 14 in a few weeks, and I would love to hear what you're looking most forward to about iOS 14 in the comments below. If you'd like to get your hands on this wallpaper, of course, I'll link it in the description as I always do. And if you haven't subscribed already, please subscribe. And if you enjoyed the video, please give it a like. As always, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.